The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail as Penelope Adams squinted at the distant horizon, her parched lips cracking as she drew another labored breath. The year was 1878, and the New Mexico territory stretched before her like an endless sea of golden-brown emptiness, beautiful and terrifying in its vastness. 3 days without proper water had left her delirious, her once sturdy mare now plodding forward on sheer instinct alone. Penelope's fingers, blistered and raw from holding the reins for countless hours, trembled as she reached for her empty canteen, knowing full well no water would come but hoping for a miracle nonetheless. "Just a little further," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. The words sounded hollow, just like the promises her late father had made about finding fortune in the West. Now, with nothing but her mother's locket and her own determination, Penelope was making her way to Cimarron, where her mother's sister supposedly lived. It was her last hope, her only chance at survival after the bank had seized their small farm back in Missouri. The landscape blurred before her eyes, rocks and cacti melding together in a hazy dance. Penelope felt her body swaying dangerously in the saddle, her consciousness slipping away like water through cupped hands. She tried to steady herself, to focus on something anything but the world tilted sideways, and suddenly she was falling, tumbling toward the unforgiving earth below. The impact never came. Instead, darkness swallowed her whole. Miles away, Mason Ryder guided his sturdy buckskin stallion down the same trail, returning from a cattle sale in Santa Fe. At 28, he'd built a modest reputation as one of the most reliable ranchers in the Cimarron area. His father's ranch, the Double R, wasn't the biggest in the territory, but it was well managed and respected. Mason had spent years learning the land, understanding its moods and seasons, developing a sixth sense for trouble. That sense prickled now as he spotted a lone horse ahead, wandering aimlessly off the trail, saddle still on its back but no rider in sight. He nudged his mount forward, scanning the horizon for any sign of the horse's owner. A flash of blue fabric against the dusty terrain caught his attention, and his heart hammered as he made out the unmistakable shape of a person sprawled motionless on the ground. "Whoa, boy," he murmured to his horse, dismounting quickly and approaching with caution. Outlaws were known to use such tactics, pretending to be injured travelers before ambushing unsuspecting Good Samaritans. But as he drew closer, he saw it was a woman, her face flushed with heat, her breathing shallow and labored. Mason knelt beside her, gently turning her onto her back. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with auburn hair that had come loose from what must have once been a neat bun. Her traveling clothes were dusty but of good quality, suggesting she wasn't a drifter or outlaw. The delicate gold locket around her neck reflected the harsh sunlight. "Miss," he called, touching her shoulder lightly. "Can you hear me?" Penelope stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering but not opening. Mason pressed 2 fingers to her wrist, finding her pulse racing but weak. Heat exhaustion, he'd seen it before, and it could turn deadly quickly in these parts. Looking around, he spotted her mare not far off, still carrying what appeared to be her belongings. With practiced efficiency, Mason set to work. He led both horses to a small outcropping of rocks that provided the only shade for miles. There he laid out his bedroll and carefully moved the unconscious woman onto it, positioning her in the deepest part of the shade. He removed her boots and loosened her collar, then retrieved his canteen. "Easy now," he murmured, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Just a little at first." He moistened his bandana and pressed it to her lips, letting tiny droplets of water seep into her mouth. He repeated this several times before moving on to dampen her forehead and wrists, hoping to bring down her body temperature. As dusk approached, Mason built a small fire, keeping watch over the mysterious woman while preparing a simple meal of jerky and beans. He'd need to stay with her through the night. Leaving her alone would mean certain death from exposure or predators. The Double R would have to wait another day for his return. Under the blanket of stars, Mason kept vigil, his rifle across his lap. The woman's breathing had steadied somewhat, but she remained unconscious. Occasionally, he would moisten her lips again with water, careful not to give her too much at once. The desert night grew cold quickly, and he draped his spare blanket over her, tucking it around her shoulders. "Who are you?" he wondered aloud, studying her face in the firelight. "And what brought you out here all alone?" The answer would have to wait. For now, all that mattered was keeping her alive until morning. Dawn broke with the gentle persistence of a whisper, painting the sky in delicate hues of pink and gold. Penelope's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding her gaze as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. The last thing she remembered was the endless trail stretching before her, the unbearable heat, and then nothing. A movement caught her attention, and she turned her head slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her neck. A man sat nearby, tending to a small fire where a coffee pot bubbled contentedly. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his worn denim shirt. A cowboy, judging by his attire and the well-used saddle propped against a nearby rock. Panic flared briefly in Penelope's chest. She was alone in the wilderness with a stranger, a man she knew nothing about. Her mother's warnings echoed in her mind, but the throbbing in her head and the bone-deep weariness in her limbs made it clear she was in no condition to flee, even if danger presented itself. As if sensing her gaze, the man looked up, his eyes a clear, steady blue meeting hers. Relief washed over his features, softening the weathered lines of his face. "You're awake," he said, his voice low and even. "Wasn't sure you'd make it through the night." Penelope tried to speak, but her throat was too dry, producing only a raspy whisper. The man immediately reached for a canteen, moving toward her with deliberate slowness as if approaching a skittish colt. "Small sips," he instructed, holding the canteen to her lips. "Too much at once will make you sick." The water was cool and sweet against her parched throat, and Penelope had to fight the urge to gulp it down greedily. After a few careful sips, she found her voice. "Thank you," she managed, her words still hoarse but audible. Where am I?" "About 20 miles east of Cimarron," the man replied, settling back on his heels. "Found you collapsed on the trail yesterday afternoon. Heat exhaustion, I reckon. Your horse was wandering nearby." Penelope's eyes widened. "Belle, is she all right?" The man nodded toward a spot behind her, and Penelope turned her head carefully to see her mare and another horse, a handsome buckskin stallion, tethered to a scrubby bush, both contentedly munching on feed from a small pile. "She's fine, thirsty and tired, but no worse for wear." He paused, studying her with a keen gaze that seemed to take in every detail. "I'm Mason Ryder. I ranch about a day's ride from here." "Penelope Adams," she replied automatically, then hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to this stranger who had seemingly saved her life. "I'm heading to Cimarron. My aunt lives there." Mason nodded, not pressing for more information. "You'll get there, but not today. You need rest and proper food before you travel again." He stood and moved back to the fire, returning with a tin cup. "Coffee's ready if you feel up to it." "Might help with that headache you're probably nursing." Penelope accepted the cup gratefully, cradling it in her hands and letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "How did you know about the headache?" A ghost of a smile crossed Mason's face. "Not my first encounter with heat exhaustion, Miss Adams. These lands can be unforgiving to those who don't respect them." The gentle rebuke wasn't lost on Penelope, and she felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. "I thought I had prepared adequately. My canteen was full when I set out, but you underestimated the distance and the heat," Mason finished for her, his tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "Happens to greenhorns all the time. Lucky for you, I happened by when I did." Lucky indeed, Penelope thought, taking a cautious sip of the strong, bitter coffee. She studied her rescuer as he moved around the small camp, efficient and at ease in this harsh environment. There was something reassuring about his presence, a quiet competence that spoke of years spent surviving in these untamed territories. "Mr. Ryder," she began, setting down her cup, "I'm deeply grateful for your assistance. Once I'm able to travel, I'll compensate you for your trouble and supplies." Mason glanced up from where he was preparing what looked like a simple breakfast, surprise evident in his expression. No need for that, Miss Adams. Anyone would have done the same. I doubt that very much, Penelope replied softly, thinking of the stories she'd heard about the dangers that lurked in the West, not just from the elements, but from the lawless men who preyed on the vulnerable. Mason shrugged, dismissing her concern with a casual grace that suggested helping strangers was simply what one did. Can you eat something? Nothing fancy, just some beans and salt pork. Need to get your strength back. Penelope nodded, suddenly aware of the hollow emptiness in her stomach. It had been at least a day since she'd eaten anything substantial. As Mason brought her a tin plate of simple but hearty fare, she realized that for the first time since her father's death, she felt safe. It was an unexpected feeling, here in the middle of nowhere with a man she'd just met. As the morning progressed, Penelope gradually regained her strength. Mason insisted she rest for the entire day, allowing her body time to recover from the ordeal. He was a man of few words, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. When he did speak, it was with purpose, offering practical advice about traveling in the territory or sharing brief anecdotes about life on his ranch. The double R isn't the biggest spread around, he told her as they shared a simple lunch of jerky and hardtack, but the land's good. Got a decent herd of cattle, some horses. My father built it from nothing, and I've been expanding it bit by bit since he passed. You live there alone? Penelope asked, then immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. Forgive me, that's none of my business. Mason didn't seem offended. Just me and a couple of ranch hands, had a foreman, old Samuel, but he retired last spring, moved to town to be near his daughter and grandkids. A shadow passed over his features. It gets quiet sometimes. Penelope understood loneliness all too well. After her mother's death when she was 16, it had been just her and her father scraping by on their small farm. When he died suddenly of pneumonia this past winter, the isolation had been almost as crushing as the grief. I know something about quiet, she said softly. Mason looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing beyond the disheveled appearance and trail dust to something deeper. For a moment, Penelope felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with her physical condition. Then he nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that required no words. By late afternoon, Penelope was able to walk short distances, stretching her legs and helping Mason prepare for the coming night. He'd already announced his intention to stay another day, insisting she wasn't ready for travel. Your aunt will wait another day, he said firmly when she protested. No sense risking a relapse by pushing too hard. As twilight descended, painting the landscape in purples and deep blues, they sat by the fire, the crackling flames providing both warmth and a hypnotic focus for their conversation. Penelope found herself telling Mason about her journey, how after her father's death and the loss of their farm, she'd scraped together enough money for the long trip west, pinning her hopes on an aunt she barely remembered from childhood visits. All I have is her name and the knowledge that she lives in Cimarron, Penelope admitted. Aunt Martha Adams. My mother always said she was the adventurous one in the family, heading west when everyone else stayed put in Missouri. Mason nodded thoughtfully. Name sounds familiar. There's a Martha Adams who owns the millinery shop in town. Widow, I believe, came out from somewhere back east 15, maybe 20 years ago. Hope flickered in Penelope's chest. That could be her. My mother mentioned she had skills as a seamstress. Seems likely, Mason agreed. Cimarron's not so big that two Martha Adams would go unnoticed. He added another small branch to the fire. She's well regarded in town, good businesswoman, fair. Relief washed over Penelope. The possibility that her aunt was not only real, but established and respected lifted a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. She'd been carrying the fear that her last remaining family connection might be as tenuous as everything else in her life had proven to be. Thank you, she said, meeting Mason's gaze across the fire, for everything. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, perhaps, or a slight relaxation of his jaw. You should get some rest, Miss Adams. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you to your aunt. As Penelope settled onto the bedroll, wrapped in Mason's spare blanket, She found herself studying him as he took up his position for the night watch. There was something compelling about this quiet, capable man who had saved her life without hesitation, and now guarded her sleep as if it were the most natural thing in the world. In the flickering firelight, his profile was strong and steady, a silhouette of reliability against the vast, unpredictable wilderness. Sleep claimed her quickly, and for the first time in months, Penelope's dreams were peaceful. The morning brought with it a new vigor. Penelope awoke feeling remarkably restored, the exhaustion and disorientation of the previous days replaced by a clear-headed determination. She found Mason already up, tending to the horses and preparing a simple breakfast. "You look better," he observed, handing her a cup of coffee. "Color's back in your cheeks." "I feel better," Penelope confirmed, accepting the cup gratefully. "Thanks to your care." Mason acknowledged her thanks with a slight nod, seemingly uncomfortable with the gratitude. "If you're feeling up to it, we can head for Cimarron today. Should reach town by nightfall if we take it easy." Penelope agreed, and after a hearty breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with a touch of molasses from Mason's supplies, they packed up the small camp. As Mason helped her mount Belle, his hands steady and respectful at her waist, Penelope was acutely aware of his proximity, of the strength in his weathered hands and the faint scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to him. "Thank you," she said again, unable to find more adequate words for what his assistance had meant to her. "Just doing what needed doing," he replied, his voice gruff but not unkind. He swung up onto his own mount with an easy grace that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. They set out at a leisurely pace, Mason leading the way along trails that seemed indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain to Penelope's untrained eye. He pointed out landmarks and signs she should learn to recognize particular rock formations, specific types of vegetation that indicated water might be nearby, subtle shifts in the landscape that could help a traveler orient themselves. "The land speaks if you know how to listen," he explained, gesturing toward a distant line of darker green that broke the golden-brown monotony. "That's a creek bed. Might be dry now, but it tells you where water flows after the rains come." Penelope absorbed these lessons eagerly, determined not to find herself in such a vulnerable position again. As they rode, Mason shared other practical knowledge about surviving in the territory, what plants were edible, which were poisonous, how to find shelter in a sudden storm. "You know so much about this place," Penelope observed during a brief rest to water the horses at a small, nearly hidden spring Mason had unerringly located. "Were you born here?" Mason shook his head, filling their canteens from the clear, cool water. "Came west with my father when I was 12 after my mother passed. He was looking for a fresh start, I think, found work as a ranch hand until he could save enough to buy his own small piece of land." A rare smile crossed his face. "Turned out he had a knack for breeding hardy cattle that could thrive in these parts, built the double R from nothing but grit and good judgment." "He sounds like a remarkable man," Penelope said softly. "He was." Mason handed her the filled canteen, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "Taught me everything worth knowing." As they continued their journey, the conversation flowed more easily between them. Penelope told Mason about growing up on the small Missouri farm, about her mother's love of books and music that had seemed so at odds with their hardscrabble existence, about her father's stubborn determination to make the land yield enough to support them. "He never quite managed it," she admitted, a familiar grief tightening her throat. "But he never stopped trying right up until the end." Mason rode quietly beside her for a moment. "Sounds like he was a man of principle." "He was," Penelope agreed, touched by the simple observation that somehow captured the essence of her father better than more elaborate eulogies had done. As the day progressed, the landscape began to change subtly, the harsh, open plains giving way to more varied terrain with scattered stands of piñon pine and juniper. By late afternoon, Mason pointed out a distant smudge on the horizon. "Cimarron," he said. "We'll be there in a couple of hours." Penelope felt a strange mix of emotions: relief at having nearly reached her destination, anticipation at the prospect of meeting her aunt, and an unexpected reluctance to end this journey with the quiet cowboy who had saved her life. She glanced at Mason's profile, wondering if he felt any similar regret at their impending parting. His expression gave nothing away, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead with the same steady focus he'd maintained throughout their journey. Yet Penelope sensed a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before, a slight stiffness in his posture that suggested he, too, was aware of the approaching end to their brief companionship. As the settlement of Cimarron grew larger on the horizon, Penelope found herself searching for things to say, questions to ask, anything to extend these last hours together. "You come into town often?" she asked finally. Mason shook his head. "Only when necessary." "Supplies, livestock sales, occasional business with the bank." He glanced at her, a hint of humor lightening his usually serious expression. "Not much of a social butterfly, in case you hadn't noticed." Penelope laughed, the sound surprising her with its ease. "I would never have guessed." His answering smile transformed his face, softening the weathered lines and bringing a warmth to his blue eyes that made Penelope's heart skip a beat. It occurred to her that in another life, under different circumstances, she might have been introduced to Mason Ryder at a church social or a town dance, might have walked out with him on summer evenings or exchanged shy glances across a crowded room. Instead, they had met in the harshest of circumstances, stripped of all social niceties, and had formed a connection that felt deeper for its unusual beginning. Penelope wasn't sure what to make of these thoughts or the fluttering sensation they produced in her chest. As they approached the outskirts of Cimarron, the trail widened into a proper road, and they began to pass small homesteads and farms. People working in fields or tending to livestock looked up at their passing, a few raising hands in greeting to Mason, who returned the gestures with brief nods. "You're known here," Penelope observed. "The Double R does business with most folks in the area one way or another," Mason replied. "And in these parts, neighbors need to know they can count on each other when trouble comes." The road led them into the heart of Cimarron, a surprisingly bustling settlement with a main street lined with wooden buildings, some simple, others more elaborate with false fronts and painted signs. There was a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, various shops, and what appeared to be a newly constructed schoolhouse at the far end of the street. Mason guided them toward a neat, two-story building with a sign that read Adams Millinery and Fine Sewing. The windows displayed several ladies' hats on wooden stands, trimmed with ribbons and artificial flowers. A small bell tinkled as the door opened, and a woman stepped out onto the boardwalk, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. She was in her early 50s, with auburn hair streaked with silver pulled back in a tidy bun. Her dress was simple but well made, with the precise stitching of someone who took pride in their needlework. As she spotted them, her expression shifted from polite curiosity to surprise. "Mason Ryder," she called, her voice warm with recognition. "Twice in 1 month, the town will start to gossip." Mason touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Mrs. Adams, think I might have found something that belongs to your family." The woman's gaze shifted to Penelope, confusion evident in her features until a sudden spark of recognition lit her eyes. "Good heavens," she breathed, one hand flying to her throat. "You're Elizabeth's girl, aren't you, Penelope?" Emotion welled up in Penelope's throat, making speech impossible for a moment. She managed a nod, relief washing over her in a dizzying wave. Her journey had not been in vain. Her aunt remembered her, recognized her even after so many years. "Oh, my dear child," Martha Adams exclaimed, hurrying forward as Mason helped Penelope dismount. The older woman embraced her niece tightly, then held her at arm's length to examine her face. "The very image of your mother. I'd know you anywhere, but how?" "Your letter said you wouldn't arrive for another week at least." "Letter?" Penelope echoed, confused. "I didn't send a letter, Aunt Martha. I wasn't even certain you were still here." Martha's brow furrowed. "But I received word just last month that you were coming, after your father's passing." She trailed off, taking in Penelope's travel-worn appearance and the obvious exhaustion still lingering beneath her improved condition. "Never mind that now, you're here and that's what matters. Come inside at once, you look dead on your feet." She turned to Mason, who had been watching the reunion with quiet satisfaction. "And you, Mr. Ryder, I suspect there's a story here that I need to hear." Mason shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Nothing much to tell, madam. Found Miss Adams on the trail, suffering from heat exhaustion. Just helped her get to where she was going." Martha's shrewd gaze suggested she knew there was more to it than that, but she didn't press him. "Then you must join us for supper at the very least. I insist." Despite his initial reluctance, Mason found himself unable to refuse the invitation, especially when Penelope added her own quiet request that he stay. The prospect of a home-cooked meal was admittedly appealing after days on the trail, and something in Penelope's expression, a mix of gratitude and something less easily defined, made the decision for him. Martha led them through the shop into a comfortable living area behind it, where a small but well-appointed apartment served as her home. She fussed over Penelope, insisting she wash up and change into clean clothes that had belonged to Martha's daughter, now married and living in Denver. When Penelope emerged from the small bedroom, her hair neatly braided and wearing a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, Mason found himself momentarily at a loss for words. Cleaned up and properly attired, Penelope Adams was not merely pretty but genuinely beautiful, with a quiet dignity that transcended her recent ordeal. The transformation was striking, and Mason realized he was staring only when Martha gave a small, knowing cough as she set plates on the table. Over a hearty meal of chicken and dumplings, Penelope and Mason took turns explaining the circumstances of their meeting and journey to Cimarron. Martha listened with increasing alarm, occasionally interrupting with exclamations of concern or questions about details. "You could have died out there, child," she said finally, reaching across the table to squeeze Penelope's hand, "if Mr. Ryder hadn't come along when he did." She turned to Mason, her expression solemn. "It seems our family owes you a tremendous debt, sir." Mason shook his head, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just did what anyone would do, Mrs. Adams." "I rather think not," Martha replied firmly. "Most men would have done the minimum necessary, perhaps left her at the nearest homestead, or simply provided water and gone on their way. You stayed with her, protected her, and personally ensured her safe arrival here. That goes well beyond common decency." Mason had no response to this assessment, so he simply nodded his acknowledgement and returned his attention to his meal. But he was acutely aware of Penelope's gaze on him, and when he glanced up, the gratitude and warmth in her eyes stirred something in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. As the evening progressed, Martha explained the mysterious letter it had come from the banker in Missouri who had handled Penelope's father's estate, informing Martha of her brother-in-law's death and Penelope's intention to seek her out in Cimarron. The letter had apparently been sent ahead as a courtesy, though Penelope had never been informed of it. "It's just as well," Martha said bracingly. "I've had time to prepare for your arrival. Your room is already upstairs, and there will be plenty for you to do if you're interested in learning the millinery trade." Penelope's relief was palpable. "I'd like that very much, Aunt Martha. I'm a fair hand with a needle, though I've never made hats before." "You'll learn quickly enough," Martha assured her. "And with the dry goods store expanding and Mrs. Peterson expecting her fourth child, I've more sewing work than I can manage alone. Your arrival is most timely." As the conversation turned to practical matters of Penelope's new life in Cimarron, Mason found himself watching her the animated way she spoke with her hands, the gentle curve of her smile, the intelligence that shone in her eyes as she discussed her aunt's business. She was a woman of substance, he realized, not merely a damsel in distress he had rescued from the trail. When the meal concluded, Mason knew it was time to take his leave. He had already stayed longer than he'd intended, and the ranch hands would be wondering about his extended absence. Yet he found himself lingering as Martha cleared the dishes, offering to help Penelope secure her belongings from her horse. In the quiet twilight outside the shop, as they unloaded Penelope's modest possessions from Belle's saddlebags, Mason found himself searching for words that would adequately express what he wanted to say. "Miss Adams," he began, then stopped, uncertain how to continue. Penelope looked up at him, her expression open and expectant. "Yes, Mr. Ryder, I'm glad things worked out with your aunt," he said finally. "Seems like you'll be in good hands here." "Thanks to you," Penelope replied softly. "I don't know how I can ever repay your kindness." Mason shook his head. "No repayment necessary, just—" He hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Just take care of yourself. Learn those landmarks we talked about if you ever travel outside town. Always carry more water than you think you'll need." His practical advice brought a smile to Penelope's lips. "I will. I promise." There was a moment of silence between them, filled with unspoken thoughts and the gentle sounds of the town settling into evening distant piano music from the saloon, the murmur of conversations from passers-by, the soft nickering of horses tied outside the hotel down the street. "Will I see you again?" Penelope asked suddenly, the directness of her question surprising them both. Mason felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest. "I come to town every few weeks for supplies. Perhaps I could call on you, if that would be acceptable." The smile that illuminated Penelope's face was answer enough, but she nodded, her eyes bright in the gathering dusk. "I would like that very much, Mr. Ryder." "Mason," he corrected gently. "After what we've been through, I think you can call me Mason." "Mason," she echoed, and something about the way she said his name made it sound new, as if she had given it a meaning it hadn't possessed before. Their farewell was brief but charged with unspoken promise. As Mason rode out of Cimarron toward the Double R, the stars emerging above him in the vast New Mexico sky, he found himself already counting the days until his next trip to town. True to his word, Mason returned to Cimarron 2 weeks later. His usual list of supplies to purchase expanded to include several items that weren't strictly necessary for ranch operations. He told himself that the new shirt and the bottle of bay rum from the barber shop were simply long overdue personal purchases. But the knowing look the general store owner gave him suggested his intentions were transparent. His first stop, however, was Adams' Millinery, where he found Martha alone in the shop, skillfully shaping the brim of a new hat. "Mr. Ryder," she greeted him warmly. "I was wondering when you might appear. Penelope is at the dry goods store delivering some mending. She should return shortly." Mason nodded, suddenly awkward now that he was here. "How is she settling in, Mrs. Adams?" "Remarkably well," Martha replied, setting aside her work. "She has a natural talent with needle and thread, and she's already learned the basics of hat making. More importantly, she's brought a fresh energy to the shop that's been missing since my daughter married and moved away." She studied him with shrewd eyes. "She speaks very highly of you, Mr. Ryder." Mason felt heat creep up his neck. "She's a remarkable young woman. Showed real grit out on the trail." "Indeed," Martha agreed. "She's been through a great deal these past months, losing her father, the farm, making such a journey alone." She shook her head. "It speaks to her character that she's emerged from such trials with her spirit intact." The bell above the shop door tinkled, interrupting their conversation as Penelope herself entered, carrying a small parcel. She stopped short at the sight of Mason, her face lighting up with a smile that made his heart skip a beat. "Mason, you came back." "Said I would," he replied simply, suddenly acutely aware of his dusty boots and trail-worn appearance. He'd meant to clean up at the hotel before calling on her, but his eagerness to see her had overridden his good sense. If Penelope noticed his dishevelment, she gave no sign of it. "Have you a dinner?" Aunt Martha and I were just about to close the shop for the afternoon meal. Before Mason could respond, Martha intervened smoothly. "Actually, my dear, I've just remembered I promised Mrs. Thornton I would deliver her new bonnet this afternoon. Perhaps Mr. Ryder would be kind enough to escort you to the hotel restaurant in my place. Their beef stew on Wednesdays is quite good." The transparent matchmaking might have been embarrassing if both Mason and Penelope hadn't been so obviously pleased with the arrangement. Minutes later, they were walking side by side down Cimarron's main street, Penelope's hand resting lightly on Mason's arm in a properly chaperoned fashion that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through him. "Your aunt is not particularly subtle," Mason observed dryly. Penelope laughed, the sound as bright and refreshing as spring water. "Subtlety is not among Aunt Martha's many virtues, but her heart is in the right place." "And what about you?" Mason asked, glancing down at her. "Is your heart in the right place about this?" He gestured vaguely between them, unable to find a more precise word for whatever was developing. Penelope's expression grew more serious, though her eyes remained warm. "I think it might be," she said softly, "though I confess this is all very new to me." "For me as well," Mason admitted. "Ranch life doesn't offer many opportunities for courting." The word hung between them, an acknowledgement of intention that made their casual stroll down the street suddenly feel momentous. Penelope's fingers tightened slightly on his arm, a small gesture of acceptance that meant more to Mason than any verbal response could have. Over the next months, Mason found himself drawn to Cimarron with increasing frequency. What had once been monthly trips for supplies became bi-weekly, then weekly visits. Each time he would call at the millinery shop, sometimes finding a reason to linger for hours, helping with small repairs around the building or simply talking with Penelope as she worked. Martha, observing their growing attachment with obvious approval, often found reasons to leave them alone together, though always within the bounds of propriety. As summer faded into autumn, Mason and Penelope's courtship blossomed. They took Sunday afternoon rides into the countryside surrounding Cimarron, Mason pointing out the features of the land he loved, Penelope absorbing his knowledge and sharing her own observations. They attended church socials and town dances, where Penelope's graceful movements and Mason's steady presence made them a well-matched pair on the dance floor, despite his initial claims of having 2 left feet. Mason found himself sharing thoughts and feelings he'd never expressed to anyone, his hopes for expanding the double R, his memories of his parents, his occasional loneliness in the vastness of the territory. Penelope, in turn, spoke of her childhood in Missouri, her dreams of one day having a family of her own, and her growing love for this rugged new homeland. "I never imagined I could feel so at home somewhere so different from where I grew up," she confessed one crisp October afternoon as they sat by the small creek that ran near the edge of town. "But there's something about this place, the openness, the challenge of it, that speaks to me." Mason understood exactly what she meant. "It gets in your blood," he said. "The land, the sky, even the hardships, they become part of you." Penelope nodded, her gaze on the distant mountains. "I used to think the stories about the West were exaggerated tales of danger and romance meant to entertain more than inform. Now I know better." She glanced at him, her expression softening. "Though I never expected to experience both the danger and the romance firsthand." The word romance hung between them, delicate yet substantial. Mason reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers in a gesture that had become familiar yet never lost its power to quicken his pulse. "When I found you on that trail," he said quietly, "I was just doing what needed doing. I never imagined." He paused, searching for words. "I never imagined that day would change the course of my life." Penelope's eyes widened slightly at the implication of his words. "Has it changed your life, I mean?" Mason nodded slowly, his gaze steady on hers. "More than I ever thought possible." Winter came early that year, with the first snowfall blanketing Cimarron in mid-November. The harsh weather made travel between the double R and town more difficult, but it didn't deter Mason. If anything, the challenge only strengthened his determination to see Penelope regularly. He invested in a sturdy sleigh that could navigate the snow-covered trails more safely than horseback, and on particularly treacherous days, he would stay at the small hotel in town rather than risk the journey back to the ranch after dark. It was during one such overnight stay, as December winds howled outside the hotel dining room windows, that Mason finally found the courage to speak what had been in his heart for months. Penelope, he began, his voice steady despite the thundering of his pulse. I've never been a man of many words, as you know. She smiled, the candlelight catching the auburn highlights in her hair. You say what needs saying, Mason. That's one of the things I admire about you. He took a deep breath, reaching across the small table to take her hand. Then I'll say this plainly, I love you. I think I started falling in love with you that first day on the trail, though I was too stubborn to recognize it then. Penelope's eyes shimmered with emotion, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. I know it hasn't been that long since we met, and maybe this is too soon, but… Mason reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. I was hoping you might consider becoming my wife. From the pouch, he produced a ring, a simple gold band with a modest diamond that had once belonged to his mother. Penelope gasped softly, her free hand flying to her lips. It's not fancy, Mason said apologetically. But it was my mother's, and she always said it should go to the woman who captured my heart as completely as she had captured my father's. Tears welled in Penelope's eyes, spilling onto her cheeks. It's perfect, she whispered. And yes, Mason, yes, I will marry you. The joy that surged through Mason at her acceptance was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, a wild, boundless happiness that made him feel invincible and humbled all at once. He slipped the ring onto her finger, marveling at how right it looked there. Your aunt will have to be told, he said, suddenly remembering the proper order of things. Penelope laughed, wiping away happy tears. Aunt Martha has been expecting this announcement for weeks. I suspect she'll be more surprised by how long it took you to ask than by the fact that you did. Mason grinned, sheepishly acknowledging the truth of this. She's a perceptive woman, your aunt. She is indeed, Penelope agreed, her expression growing more serious. And she's been more than just family to me these past months. She's given me a home, a purpose, a future when I had none. Her blessing means everything to me. Then we'll speak to her tonight, Mason decided. No sense waiting. Martha's reaction to their news was exactly as Penelope had predicted, delight mixed with playful exasperation at how long the proposal had taken. She embraced them both, declaring it was about time and immediately launching into discussions of wedding preparations. Spring would be lovely, she suggested. After the worst of the mud season but before the summer heat, the apple trees behind the church should be in bloom by late April. Mason and Penelope exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Actually, Penelope said gently, we were hoping for something sooner, perhaps after Christmas. Martha raised an eyebrow. So soon, what's the rush, my dears? No particular rush, Mason explained, his hand finding Penelope's. Just seems pointless to wait when we both know what we want. Martha studied them for a moment, then nodded, a knowing smile playing at her lips. Well, I suppose the heart doesn't always follow a convenient timetable. Christmas is only a few weeks away, but I dare say we can manage something simple and elegant with a bit of effort. And manage they did. The weeks leading up to Christmas were a flurry of preparations, with Martha's connections in town ensuring that everything necessary for a proper wedding could be arranged despite the winter weather. The church was reserved for the day after Christmas, a date that would allow the holiday celebrations to be enjoyed without distraction before the wedding festivities began. Penelope threw herself into the preparations while continuing to work alongside her aunt in the shop. She sewed her own wedding dress, a creation of ivory satin with delicate lace trim that Martha declared was finer than anything she'd ever made herself. Mason, meanwhile, focused on preparing the double R for his bride, enlarging and refurbishing the main house with the help of his ranch hands and carpenters from town. A woman needs proper comforts, he explained when Penelope protested that she didn't require anything fancy. Besides, I've been meaning to expand the place for years. You're just giving me the excuse I needed. The day after Christmas dawned clear and cold, the world outside transformed into a glistening wonderland of fresh snow and ice-laden branches that sparkled in the sunlight. In Martha's cozy apartment behind the millinery shop, Penelope stood before the mirror, hardly recognizing the radiant woman who gazed back at her. Your mother would be so proud, Martha said softly, adjusting the simple veil that crowned Penelope's upswept hair. "As would your father." Tears threatened, but Penelope blinked them away, determined not to arrive at the church with reddened eyes. "I wish they could be here," she whispered. "They are, in their own way," Martha assured her, touching the gold locket that hung around Penelope's neck, the same locket she had been wearing the day Mason found her on the trail. "And you're beginning a new family today, one that will carry their legacy forward." At the small white church that stood at the end of Cimarron's Main Street, Mason waited nervously, tugging at the collar of his new suit and resisting the urge to pace. The building was filled with townsfolk, some he knew well, others merely acquaintances, all united in their goodwill toward the couple. In the months since Penelope's arrival, she had endeared herself to the community with her gentle manner and willingness to help wherever needed. When the church doors opened and Penelope appeared on Martha's arm, standing in for the father who couldn't be there, Mason felt his breath catch in his throat. She was a vision of grace and beauty, but it was the love shining in her eyes as they met his that truly staggered him. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that finding her on that trail had been not chance, but destiny, the hand of Providence guiding him to the other half of his soul. The ceremony was brief but deeply meaningful, their vows exchanged with clear voices despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm them both. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the joy that erupted in the small church spilled out into the snowy street as the congregation followed the newlyweds outside, showering them with well wishes and handfuls of rice that glistened like diamond dust against the snow. The reception that followed at the town hotel was a lively affair, with music and dancing continuing well into the evening. As tradition dictated, Mason and Penelope eventually slipped away, boarding the sleigh that would carry them to the Double R, now their shared home. The journey through the moonlit winter landscape was magical, the runners of the sleigh whispering over the snow as they traveled in comfortable silence, wrapped in warm blankets and the newness of their married state. When they finally arrived at the ranch, Mason helped Penelope from the sleigh, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Ryder," he said softly as he set her down in the front room, where a fire had been laid in preparation for their arrival. Penelope looked around the space that would now be hers to manage and make truly a home. The improvements Mason had worked so hard on were evident: new curtains at the windows, comfortable furniture arranged around the hearth, a small bookshelf already containing some of her favorite volumes that Martha had helped him select as a surprise. "It's perfect," she said, turning to face him. "Everything is perfect." Later that night, as they lay entwined in the large bed that had been Mason's wedding gift to them both, Penelope traced the contours of his face with gentle fingers, still marveling that this strong, good man was now her husband. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day?" she asked softly. Mason caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I try not to," he admitted. "The thought of you out there alone." He shook his head. "Let's just say I'm grateful every day that I was on that trail at that exact moment." "As am I," Penelope whispered. "Though I suspect we would have found each other somehow, even if it hadn't happened that way. Some things are just meant to be." Mason pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair. "I believe you're right, Mrs. Ryder. Some things are definitely meant to be." Spring came to the New Mexico territory in a riot of wildflowers and green grasses, transforming the landscape from its winter austerity to a softer, more welcoming vista. At the Double R, Penelope had settled into ranch life with a natural ease that both surprised and delighted Mason. She had taken over the household management with quiet efficiency, creating a warm and inviting home while also learning the basics of ranch operations. "Never thought I'd see the day when a city-bred woman would take to branding calves with such enthusiasm," remarked Samuel, Mason's former foreman who had returned temporarily to help with the spring roundup. Mason grinned, watching as Penelope competently recorded the tally of calves in the ledger book she'd established for better record keeping. She's full of surprises, Samuel, and she wasn't exactly city-bred, grew up on a small farm back east. Still, Samuel mused, most women would be content to stay in the house, leave the dust and blood to the menfolk. You got yourself a special one there, boss. Don't I know it, Mason agreed, his chest swelling with pride as Penelope looked up and caught his eye across the corral, a smudge of dirt on her cheek and a smile that outshone the spring sunshine. Their first year of marriage flowed like the seasons, each day bringing new joys and challenges that they faced together. Penelope continued to assist her aunt in the millinery shop during their weekly trips to Cimarron, maintaining a connection to the work she had come to enjoy and the aunt who had become such an important part of her life. Martha, for her part, was a frequent visitor to the ranch, delighting in the role of surrogate mother and advisor to the young couple. As summer approached, Penelope began to suspect a change in her condition. The telltale signs were subtle at first: a new sensitivity to certain smells, unusual fatigue in the afternoons, a slight fullness to her figure that hadn't been there before. She kept her suspicions to herself, waiting for certainty before sharing the news with Mason. That certainty came on a warm June morning when she could no longer button her favorite dress comfortably around the middle. Standing before the mirror in their bedroom, Penelope placed a hand over the gentle swell of her abdomen, a sense of wonder washing over her. Their child was growing within her, a new life born of the love she and Mason shared. She found him in the barn, repairing a broken stall door with focused concentration. For a moment, Penelope simply watched him work, his strong hands moving with practiced skill, his brow furrowed in concentration. This man who had saved her life on the trail, who had courted her with such respectful determination, who had made her his wife and partner in all things, he was about to become a father. "Mason," she called softly, her voice betraying her emotion. He looked up immediately, setting aside his tools at the sound of her voice. "Penny, everything all right?" She smiled at the nickname he'd begun using in their private moments together. "Everything is perfect," she assured him, moving to stand before him, "but there's something I need to tell you." Mason's expression grew concerned as he noted the unusual solemnity in her manner. "What is it?" Instead of answering directly, Penelope took his hand and placed it gently against her stomach. For a moment, Mason looked puzzled, then understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by an expression of such pure joy that Penelope felt tears spring to her own eyes in response. "A baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We're having a baby." Penelope nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Mason pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious glass, even as his embrace communicated the depth of his happiness. "When?" he asked, drawing back slightly to look into her face. "Sometime in January, I think," Penelope replied. "Dr. Morrison in town can confirm it when we visit next week." Mason laughed, a sound of pure delight. "A winter baby seems fitting given we were married in winter." His expression softened as he gazed at her. "Are you happy, Penny, truly?" "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she assured him, reaching up to touch his face. "A year ago I was alone and desperate, with no home and no future I could see. Now I have you, this ranch, a family of my own beginning." She shook her head in wonder. "It's more than I ever dared hope for." The news of Penelope's pregnancy spread quickly through their small community, bringing an outpouring of well wishes and practical gifts from neighbors and townsfolk alike. Martha was especially thrilled, immediately beginning work on a layette of delicately embroidered baby clothes and soft blankets. "I always hoped for grandchildren," she confessed to Penelope during one of their sewing sessions. "When my own daughter chose not to have children, I thought perhaps that dream was not to be, and now," she gestured to the tiny gown she was finishing, "now I shall be a great aunt, which is just as wonderful." As Penelope's body changed with the advancing pregnancy, Mason became increasingly protective, insisting she rest more and delegate some of her responsibilities around the ranch. Penelope accepted his concern with good grace, though she drew the line at becoming completely inactive. "I'm with child, not ill," she reminded him gently when he protested her continuing to help with the household accounts and lighter ranch duties. Dr. Morrison himself said moderate activity is beneficial. Mason reluctantly agreed, though he made certain the ranch hands knew to keep an eye on Mrs. Ryder and report back to him if she appeared to be overtaxing herself. This arrangement led to some good-natured teasing from the men, who nonetheless took their protective duties seriously, having come to respect and admire the boss's wife for her competence and kindness. The summer passed into fall, and Penelope's condition became more pronounced. By October, she was unmistakably pregnant, her slender frame now supporting a neat, rounded belly that seemed to grow daily. Mason found himself fascinated by the changes in her body, often resting his hand on her abdomen in quiet moments, hoping to feel the baby's movements. The first time he felt a decisive kick against his palm, his expression of startled wonder made Penelope laugh out loud. "Someone's eager to meet you," she teased. "Boy or girl, doesn't matter," Mason declared, though Penelope noticed he began referring to the baby as he more often than not in their private conversations. The thought of a son, a little boy with Mason's steady blue eyes and quiet strength, warmed her heart, though she would be equally delighted with a daughter to raise in this wild, beautiful land they called home. As winter approached once more, bringing with it the anniversary of their meeting and subsequent marriage, preparations for the baby's arrival intensified. The small room adjoining their bedroom was transformed into a nursery, with a cradle crafted by one of the ranch hands who had previously worked as a carpenter back east. Martha contributed curtains and soft bedding, while neighbors and friends from town added their own offerings: hand-knitted booties, a rocking horse carved by the blacksmith's father, a patchwork quilt from the ladies' sewing circle. "This child will be the most thoroughly equipped baby in the entire territory," Penelope observed as she and Mason sorted through the gifts one evening. "And the most thoroughly loved," Mason added, his arm around her shoulders as they sat before the fire, the wind howling outside a reminder of the harsh winter that had just begun. The first snow fell in early December, earlier than the previous year and heavier. Mason watched the accumulation with concern, thinking of the baby's expected arrival in January and the potential difficulty of getting to town if complications arose. After consulting with Dr. Morrison during their last visit to Cimarron, he made arrangements for the doctor to stay at the ranch for a few days around Penelope's expected delivery date. "Better safe than sorry," he explained to Penelope when she protested the expense and inconvenience to the doctor. "I'm not taking any chances with you or our child." Christmas that year was a quiet affair at the Double R, with only Martha joining them for the holiday. The weather had made travel difficult, but Mason had insisted on bringing his mother-in-law from town, knowing how important it was to Penelope to have her aunt present as her time drew near. As they sat around the table for Christmas dinner, Penelope felt a profound sense of contentment, looking at the two people who had become her family in this new life. Martha, her face alight with the excitement of the coming birth; Mason, his steady presence a constant source of strength and love. The journey that had begun in desperation on that dusty trail had led her here, to this moment of perfect belonging. "I'd like to propose a toast," Mason said, raising his glass, "to family, the one we've made and the one that's about to join us." "To family," echoed Martha and Penelope, their glasses meeting with a gentle chime. Later that night, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Penelope felt the baby shift restlessly within her. Mason's hand came to rest on her rounded belly, a gesture that had become ritual between them. "Not much longer now," he murmured, his voice warm against her ear. "No," Penelope agreed, placing her hand over his. "Our greatest adventure is about to begin." The baby came not in January as expected, but in the early hours of New Year's Day, 1880, as if eager to greet the new decade with its arrival. Penelope's labor began shortly after midnight, waking her from a sound sleep with the unmistakable tightening of her abdomen. For a moment she lay still, waiting to see if it was a false alarm, but when the sensation returned with greater intensity a few minutes later, she knew their child was on its way. "Mason," she said quietly, touching his shoulder. "It's time." He was instantly alert, years of responding to nighttime emergencies on the ranch serving him well in this moment. With calm efficiency, he helped Penelope into a comfortable position, propping her up with pillows before lighting the lamps and going to rouse Martha, and send one of the ranch hands to fetch Dr. Morrison from the guest cabin where he had been staying since the day after Christmas. The labor progressed steadily through the night, with Dr. Morrison monitoring Penelope's condition and Martha providing practical support and encouragement. Mason refused to leave his wife's side, holding her hand through each contraction and wiping her brow with a cool cloth as the hours passed. As dawn broke on the first day of the new year, Penelope's efforts intensified. Dr. Morrison's instructions became more urgent, his experienced hands guiding the baby's passage into the world. With one final, tremendous push, Penelope felt the release of pressure and then heard the indignant cry of new life entering the world. "A boy," Dr. Morrison announced, holding up the squalling infant for the new parents to see. "A fine, healthy son." Mason's face, tense with concern throughout the long night, broke into a smile of such radiance that Penelope felt her heart might burst with love for him. Tears streamed down his cheeks unashamedly as the doctor placed the swaddled infant in his arms. "Look what we did, Penny," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Look at our son." He carefully transferred the baby to Penelope's waiting arms. She gazed down at the tiny face, still red and wrinkled from birth, and felt an overwhelming surge of love unlike anything she had ever experienced. This was her child, hers and Mason's, a perfect blending of them both. "Hello, little one," she murmured, tracing a finger along his cheek. "We've been waiting for you." They named him William Thomas Ryder William for Mason's father, Thomas for Penelope's. From the beginning, he proved to be a strong, healthy child with his father's blue eyes and what promised to be his mother's auburn hair. Martha declared him the handsomest baby ever born in the territory, an assessment with which his parents wholeheartedly agreed. The first months of William's life passed in a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and the countless small discoveries that come with new parenthood. Mason, who had initially been hesitant about handling such a tiny, seemingly fragile being, quickly became adept at soothing his son's cries and even changing the occasional diaper when Penelope was particularly exhausted. "Never thought I'd see the day when the toughest rancher in Cimarron County was singing lullabies," remarked Samuel during one of his visits to the Double R. Mason merely grinned, unembarrassed as he gently rocked his son to sleep. "Man's got to have his priorities straight, Samuel." Spring brought new growth to the land and new developments for young William, who began to smile responsively and show interest in the world around him. By summer, he was attempting to crawl, much to his parents' delight and consternation as they suddenly realized how many potential hazards existed in their home for a mobile infant. "He's got your determination," Mason observed as William stubbornly pushed himself up on his hands and knees for the 10th time after repeatedly falling forward onto his belly. "And your stubbornness," Penelope countered affectionately, watching their son's concentrated efforts. Life settled into a new pattern at the Double R1, centered around the needs and joys of raising their son while continuing to build their ranch and their life together. Penelope found a balance between motherhood and her other interests, still helping with the ranch accounts and occasionally assisting Martha in the millinery shop when they visited town. Mason proved to be an engaged and loving father, often carrying William with him in a specially designed sling as he conducted his daily rounds of the ranch. By the time William celebrated his first birthday on that snowy New Year's Day of 1881, the Ryder family had expanded in another way as well. The Double R had nearly doubled in size with the acquisition of neighboring land that had come up for sale when its elderly owner decided to move east to live with his daughter. The purchase had been a significant investment, but one that Mason and Penelope agreed would secure their son's future and allow them to build something truly substantial to pass on to him and perhaps other children in the years to come. Those other children arrived sooner than expected. In the spring of 1881, Penelope discovered she was expecting again, this time with what Dr. Morrison suspected might be twins, given the rapid expansion of her midsection and the multiple heartbeats he detected with his stethoscope. 2 babies. Mason repeated when Penelope shared the news, looking both thrilled and slightly terrified at the prospect. At once, so it seems, Penelope confirmed, laughing at his expression. "Are you up to the challenge, Mr. Ryder?" His answer was to sweep her into a careful embrace, mindful of her condition. "With you by my side, Mrs. Ryder, I'm up to any challenge." The twins, a boy and a girl they named Robert James and Elizabeth Martha, arrived in November of 1881. Smaller than William had been, but equally healthy and strong-willed. The household instantly became a whirlwind of activity, with Martha moving in temporarily to help Penelope manage the demands of 3 children under the age of 2. "I never imagined such happiness," Penelope confessed to Mason late one night as they checked on their sleeping children, William in his small bed, the twins in their shared cradle. "Sometimes I'm afraid it's all a dream, that I'll wake up and find myself back on that trail, alone and lost." Mason's arm tightened around her waist. "Not a dream, Penny, and you'll never be alone again, I promise you that." As the years passed, the double R flourished, as did the Ryder family. William grew into a thoughtful, responsible boy who shadowed his father's every move and showed an early aptitude for understanding the land and the livestock. The twins developed distinct personalities. Robert, always called Robbie, was outgoing and adventurous, while Elizabeth, Lizzie to the family, combined her mother's gentle nature with a surprising stubbornness that often left her parents exchanging amused glances over her head. In 1884, the family welcomed another daughter, Abigail Rose, completing their family circle. By then, the Double R had become one of the most prosperous ranches in the territory, known for its quality livestock and fair business practices. Mason's reputation as a cattleman was matched by Penelope's as a community leader, involved in establishing Cimarron's first proper school and organizing a lending library for the growing town. Martha continued to run her millinery shop well into her 60s, though she gradually turned more of the business over to her assistant, preferring to spend time with her great-nieces and nephews. When she finally retired completely in 1890, she sold the shop and moved to the Double R, taking up residence in a comfortable cottage that Mason and the ranch hands had built specifically for her near the main house. "Full circle," she remarked to Penelope on her first evening in her new home. "You came west seeking shelter with me, and now I'm finding my final home with you." "Not final," Penelope corrected firmly, "just the next chapter." Indeed, Martha thrived in her role as beloved matriarch of the extended Ryder family, teaching the children everything from proper manners to the art of storytelling, her sharp mind and warm heart making her an indispensable presence in their lives. In 1898, 20 years after Penelope had collapsed on that fateful trail and Mason had kept vigil through the night, they stood together on the porch of the Double Artiques main house, watching the sunset paint the New Mexico sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. Their children were growing up. William, now 18, had just returned from his first year at college in Denver. The twins, nearly 17, were busy with their own interests, Robbie with horses, Lizzie with her studies, and 14-year-old Abby was becoming a young lady before their eyes. "Do you ever think about that day?" Penelope asked softly, leaning into the familiar comfort of Mason's embrace. "The day we met, every day," Mason replied without hesitation. "Every single day." Penelope turned in his arms to face him, studying the face she had come to know better than her own, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper now, silver threading through his dark hair, but his gaze still as clear and steady as it had been that first day when she'd awakened to find him watching over her. I was so lost, she whispered. In every way a person can be lost. Mason's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch as gentle now as it had been when he'd first tended to her. And I was just going through the motions, not really living, not until you. We saved each other, I think, Penelope said, covering his hand with her own, and built this wonderful life together. The best decision I ever made, Mason agreed, was to stop on that trail and help a stranger. And the best luck I ever had, Penelope replied, was collapsing where you would find me. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, they remained on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the legacy of love they had built from that chance encounter on a dusty trail 20 years before, a legacy that would continue to flourish in their children and grandchildren for generations to come. The exhausted woman and the cowboy who guarded her through the night had found in each other not just rescue, but redemption, purpose, and a love that had proven as vast and enduring as the New Mexico sky above them.